Welcome to the lecture on the causes of the Civil War. And like I said, these are all about the causes of the Civil War, so hopefully for this next unit coming up, you can use this information instead of actually going and looking in a textbook, your notes, or whatever. So hopefully we'll have some fun this week in class. Now the very first thing that you need to know is that the causes of the Civil War, they're varied. They come from a lot of different sources, but it's all centered around one idea: manifest destiny. Once the United States wanted to move west, don't forget, they wanted to go westward. Why? Because there's a lot of land out there, and what's manifest destiny again? That's right, the belief that Americans earned the West Coast, that they earned the right to go to California. Now of course, this caused many problems for many Americans across the United States, because up until manifest destiny, the United States was split between two different areas. You have the slaves in the South, or those that supported the slaves, and you have the North, the people who did not believe that slaves were right. The problem was that the South wanted to keep the slaves, but the North wanted to get rid of them. It makes sense at the time. Cotton, the entire industry of cotton in the South was run by slaves. Now, of course, could they have paid workers to do this work? Probably. They still probably made a decent amount of money still, all the white slave plantation owners. But the thing is that the slaves made everything cheaper. Made it a lot cheaper, so they made a lot of money a lot quicker. Although it would have been more honest and moral to get rid of slaves, you cannot turn down a lot of free cash. It's not going to happen. So, why did the North not overpower the South? Why didn't the South overpower the North and make slaves everywhere? If the North overpowered the South, they could get rid of slaves. Why didn't this happen? Well, the thing is that there were the equal amount of states in the North and the South, so that even in Congress, one could not overpower the other. Now don't forget, in Congress, you have to have majority in both representation and in Congress, in the Senate, in order to actually get anything passed. The problem here is that the Senate was split 50-50. The House of Representatives was split 50-50. So how do you expect anything to get passed? Well, you can't just make new people, but what you can do is make new states. And that's where a lot of the conflict came from. Once new land was acquired through the Louisiana Purchase, through the Mexican-American War, and the Oregon Treaty, a lot of new land opened up that allowed the United States basically to go the entire way to the Pacific Ocean. With all this new land there, they knew that there was a lot of opportunities to create more states. And if you could create more states, well, what's bad about that? Especially if you can get that state to come in on the side of slavery or freedom in the North. You get enough power in Congress to be able to take over Congress and get one side supported. Get slaves banned, or have slaves brought through the entire United States. Now, obviously Congress is smarter than this. So how are they going to get over this problem? Well, just like any smart person is going to do, well, hopefully a smart person, you're going to come to a compromise. The only problem here is that these compromises, they act as a band-aid. Just like if you get a cut on your hand or your arm, you put a band-aid on it. Should you go get stitches? Well, if it's really bad, yes. And that's the problem with this. The United States had a big gashing wound in their hand. And instead of going and getting stitches like they should have, they said, it's cheaper, let's just throw some band-aids on it. That'll fix it for now. Oh, the band-aid might soak up some blood now, but 2 days down the road, 4 days down the road, you think it's going to be healed? Of course not. So, the United States doesn't realize this until later on. But the band-aid, the first band-aid they apply, is something called the Missouri Compromise. They realize that the land out west needs to be decided as to whether or not it's going to be free or slave states. The very first thing they do, Missouri Compromise says everything below 36 degrees 30 minutes north, everything above it is going to be a free state. Anything below it is going to be a slave state. Now, I know a lot of you geography whizzes out there are going, that's ridiculous. And it is. Because if you look at a map, you will see that the entire United States, when you spread it out, there's a lot more land north of that line than south of that line. But the problem is, this is 1820. They do not know that. At least they know a vague idea, but they do not know how big of a difference it is. So now they have this line set up. The problem is Missouri has a lot of slaves, and it sits just above the line. So what's going to happen? They're going to allow an exception. Now remember what I said about Congress needs to be even? Missouri comes in as a slave state, so they have to find somewhere that they can put a free state. Now all the way up here, even though the land is already taken, and there's a lot of settlement up here, all the way up in New England, they find room for Maine. And Maine comes in as a free state to offset Missouri. Hopefully, you would think the future for the United States is set. Anything above the Missouri Compromise line will be free. Anything below will be slave. Unfortunately, this does not hold up. 1850 comes around, and you have the Compromise of, guess what it is? Compromise of 1850. And they set up a new system for deciding whether or not these new states would become free or slave. Instead of just handing out descriptions willy-nilly, well, Maine's going to be free and Missouri's going to be slave. They're not going to just do that anymore, because that's maybe too easy, but maybe you don't really know. Especially if they're right along that 3630 line, you don't really know if they want slaves or not. And you can't impose it upon them. So they decide to use something called popular sovereignty. This is going to be something that allows the people in the state to vote whether or not they want to be a slave or a free state. This sounds great. Finally, you get the opportunity to let the people decide for themselves. Immediate first problem. What is it? What? Of course. What happens if you have two slaves that come in as a slave state? Or two slaves that come in as a free state? It doesn't allow for these compromises anymore. One state is eventually going to become a free state, and the second one's going to become a free state. And then you have Congress unbalanced, or both slave and Congress is unbalanced. Neither side wants to lose like this. Luckily for Congress, the Compromise of 1850, nothing really bad happens. The two major states that this compromise was made about was Utah and New Mexico. Now I know what you're thinking. There's no way this is going to work. Because if you have two slave states that come in, they'll offset the balance. If you have two free states that come in, they will also offset the balance. So what are you to do? Now, this didn't really matter all that much, because if you actually look at the Compromise of 1850, it focuses on two states that don't even become states until after the Civil War. So they don't really even matter. Congress gets really lucky on this one. It's Utah and New Mexico. And they don't even become states, like I said, until after the Civil War. So Congress thinks they got lucky on this one. They don't actually have to worry about it, and they created this brand new system for figuring out states. Sounds great. Also, Congress slips in something called, well, it's actually called the, Meanwhile, Congress secretly slips in something called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, along with the Compromise of 1850. This is done to make the slave states feel a little bit better about the compromise, because they really didn't like it. Now, what it does is it requires any northerner to take a slave if they find him free in the north, and take him and put him back in the south. Now this forces a lot of northerners to go against their own personal beliefs, and a lot of northerners hate this. And we'll get to that later, why that's so important. But it forces northerners to do what they don't want to do. But Congress slips it through with the Compromise of 1850. Now, they try their hand at this again, the whole idea of popular sovereignty. So, you have two new states that want to join the Union. Don't forget, the Union is just another word for the United States. You have Kansas and Nebraska that both want to come in. But the problem is that they are basically right on top of one another, and they don't really know which one should be free and which one should be slave. Popular sovereignty is used again, and guess what? This time it goes really bad. Really, really bad. You have something called border ruffians, and ruffian makes you kind of sound like someone that's rough around the edges, dangerous, scary. And that's exactly what it is. Just because they allow you to choose who you are doesn't mean you can actually make sure it's done properly. So nowadays you want to go to vote, and you'll find out in a few years, you go to the voting place and you show your ID. They have electronic systems to make sure that you really are who you say you are. The problem is, back in 1850, or thereabouts, you do not have all these electronic sources. So anyone that was in the state could vote. People from the south came up, people from the north came down, and flooded these two states, killing anyone that disagreed with them and casting votes that they should not have been able to cast because they really weren't citizens of those states. Not only that, but they used dead people, they took their names, they took their identities, went to graveyards, wrote down people's names, and used those to vote to try and influence the end result. Both sides did this, the free and the slave supporters. So, there was a term that came out to describe this entire process that happened because of the border ruffians, both from the north and the south. Both sides were guilty. And this was called Bleeding Kansas. As you probably can guess, it's titled Bleeding Kansas because so many people died during this. The water basically ran red with blood. There were so many people that died. Whole towns were wiped out. It was a horrific event in American history. In the end of it, Kansas becomes a free state. Nebraska doesn't become a state until after the Civil War, so Nebraska doesn't really matter. Now you might be wondering, why did the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 make a difference? Well, because it made the Northerners angry. It was forcing them to do something against their will. And this is a time when they were just starting to figure out that slavery might not be all that good. There were popular books at the time that described slave life. Now, the earlier books described slave life that made them sound happy, that the slave owners were taking great care of them. But the problem was that the slave owners really weren't. Now, we already know about slave life. We've already covered that. But the Northerners didn't know about this in 1850. Now, a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe comes out and shows the entire Northerners how horrific slave life really was. Now, of course, it was a little bit exaggerated, like anything is. But it showed Northerners what slave life was really like. And it starts to get Northerners angry about the type of life that the slaves are living. Also, there was something called the Dred Scott decision, which forced Northerners to accept the fact that slaves were property. Even if a slave ran away from Missouri, ran away from Kentucky, or Georgia, or Louisiana, he still had to be returned to that place because he was still considered property, even if he made it all the way to Canada. Now, we've already talked about Canada as a location that the Underground Railroad went to, as the end perfect destination where slaves could escape. The problem is that now, because of the Dred Scott decision, which is a Supreme Court decision, says that slaves are property, and no matter where they go, they will remain property. A slave could go to Antarctica, Australia, Europe, Russia, anywhere. If he went even back to Africa, he would still be considered a slave if he was found. This caused a lot of Northerners to be angry because a lot of them were helping slaves escape just to find out that the South was working against them. Now, the very final straw was that in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. While Abraham Lincoln always believed that slavery should not be expanded, he did not believe that slavery should have been gotten rid of, which is important because when he goes to fight the Civil War, he believes that he's fighting the Civil War to restore the Union. Now that's very important. Restore the Union. He doesn't believe that slavery should be abolished. He believes that the Union should be preserved. Slavery is abolished through many different ways throughout the war, but that is not the primary cause. So when Abraham Lincoln is elected, the South perceive him, because he's a Northerner, as someone who wants to get rid of the slaves. Like I just said, that's incorrect. But the South didn't know this. So once he becomes elected, South Carolina leaves the Union, and they are the first ones to do it. Abraham Lincoln decides to try and preserve the Union, and the Civil War begins. Now I really hope you enjoyed this lecture. You can go back, watch any part you didn't understand, and come ready for class, because if you understand this, we get to some really cool activities during class, and I know you'll enjoy that. Have a good day, and see you tomorrow.